Welcome, everyone on Zoom. Hi, thank you so much for joining us. My name is April Mack. I am with 805 Escrow. I am an account executive here. And one of my primary goals is to provide you with so much resources and marketing and training that you elevate in your business, because when you do well, so do we. And today is my very honor to host our monthly training with our very own Megan DeCito, a 1031 exchange specialist. She is our go-to person for all of our 1031 exchanges. If you haven't heard of what that is, this is the perfect place for you to be. And I kind of want to get a little gauge from who do we have in our Zoom right now, and our attendees here, who has actually heard of a 1031 exchange? We have hands. And in the chat, if you're in Zoom, open up your chat. You are going to play out too. We want to hear what you have to say as well. So open up your chat for not only to answer our questions, but to ask questions, because this is going to be interactive. So Megan and I are going to have a little chit chat, and we want to make sure that you guys fully understand what 1031 exchanges are, how you can utilize them to better your own personal business and to provide value to your clients. So with that being said, I would love to introduce Megan DeCito with, like I said, 1031 exchange specialist. I'll let her tell you all about herself because she is the expert in herself, as well as 1031 exchange specialist. So.
Thank you, April. That was a wonderful introduction. Hi, everybody. Yes, my name is Megan DeCito, and I am a qualified intermediary, also known as a exchange accommodator. But what I do is facilitate 1031 exchanges. So I've been doing exchanges for at least 15 years, but I've been in the real estate industry for probably 20 years. So I go all the way back to year 2000, where I kind of out of college took my first job, and it was working inside of a law firm, and the husband was the attorney and the wife ran the exchange business. I didn't know anything about real estate, but what I found that it was just so fascinating that you could interact, and there's so many different avenues in real estate that you could learn from. So you can learn from escrow and title, you can learn from lending, you can learn from real estate investors. So that's what drew me in, and I realized, like, this isn't just any job, this is really just, it's a career. So that's kind of where I just started soaking it in, and the more I got into it, I realized how valuable I can become for so many people, because most people don't know the ins and outs of 1031 exchanges, and most don't realize how it works or why they would need it. So that's what's kept me in this industry for so long. So I'm really happy that you brought me along to help educate your group.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Megan. So a lot of you said, yes, you are familiar with 1031 exchanges. Those in Zoom, if you've not, I mean, who hasn't heard of a 1031 exchange? Sergio, do we have anyone in the chat right now that's chiming in and letting us know? Because I really want to focus in on how we can, so a lot of you know what 1031 exchanges are. So today's presentation is really going to be value added. So we really want to get to the nitty gritty of how you can actually elevate. So if everybody knows about 1031 exchanges, maybe we bypass what it actually is and go right into the nitty gritty. So do we have anyone that hasn't heard of what a 1031 exchange is? It's a little silent over there on the Zoom.
We're getting a refresher.
Okay, cool. Well, we're glad because we do have a very thorough presentation. Megan, like I said, is the specialist. So just give us a little brief summary of what a 1031 exchange actually is.
Sure. So we are talking about a section of the Internal Revenue Code. So we're talking about the statute, which pertains to the section 1031 exchange. And this is available to all real estate investors throughout the United States. So it's not just state run, it's a federal statute. And this allows real estate investors to defer paying any capital gains tax when they're selling an investment property, as long as they reinvest those monies into another type of investment property that is hopefully equal or greater in value. So we're not talking about primary residences, homes that you primarily use for personal use. We are merely talking about investment properties, which come in various forms. So.
And you guys, I don't know if you have any clients or past clients that own a property that was primarily their property, and then they decided to, move away for about a year, and they're like, I'm just going to rent it out for a year. And if you ask them, hey, you're an investor, they might say, no, I'm not, because a lot of people think, oh, investors are people that just buy a lot of properties that have, they're landlords of multiple properties, multi-unit properties, or they're flippers, right? So understand that an investor is actually just one person who holds title to a property and then rents it out and gets income from that. That's why Uncle Sam likes to have a say in all of this. This is what the whole point of having this discussion anyways, is because Uncle Sam, as soon as you get income from that property, whether it was intended to be your primary property and you just decided to rent it out once, that's why this is so important, right? Because once you sell that property and if you've been collecting, then, well, yeah, Uncle Sam says, hey, guess what? I want some of that money.
And that's a really good point. But the point that I really want to hit home with is that it really boils down to how you report the property. So you need to make sure that you've been reporting the property to Uncle Sam as an investment property for it to really qualify. So if you've been living in the house and maybe you have rented it out for only a few months and you haven't necessarily reported that income to the IRS yet, maybe that doesn't qualify. So if you're unsure about whether your property qualifies, you can either call me or you can actually ask your accountant. So that's really the best bet in the first place that I would probably go to and suggest that you go to if you're questioning whether or not your property actually qualifies to do a 1031 exchange. So.
Very cool. Well, call to action for you realtors out there. This is a great talking point for your clients. So if you have your database, which all of you should have, and maintain your database very well, go into your database and start reaching out to people that you know are renting out their homes and say, hey, like this is something that I don't know if you're aware of. This is a tax deferred situation, and here's my information on that. So this is a great talking point. It's a great reach out, right? We want to nurture our clients. We want to stay in touch with them. So use this as an opportunity to reach out to those clients that potentially rent out their home. So you can see what their next steps are and let them know, like, hey, just so you know, this is something to be aware of in the future.
Absolutely. And I want to just tag onto that as well. So I think another good reach out is these people who've become accidental landlords. So maybe they've acquired a property or inherited a property that has been in the family that's been rented out for so long, and maybe they don't know that they can do a 1031 exchange. So those long-term investors are probably the ones that you might want to reach out to, because they may not know that this even exists because they haven't been in the game about selling their investment property ever, or nor have had this conversation. So
very good. So homework number one, go through your database and find out who is renting out the property so that you can have this conversation with them. So now we talk about qualifying properties though. So tell us a little bit about what exactly is a qualifying property.
So you'll hear the term like kind or like for like, and really, it really just boils down to the use of the property. It has to be an investment property. And there are some exceptions to that rule. So we're talking about single family residences that you rent out, of course. Vacation homes can qualify under these parameters if you have used the home for personal use 2 weeks or less out of the year. So if you have a property, which my husband and I have, we had an Airbnb property and we would use it for weekends here, weekends there. That would still qualify for 1031 exchange because the primary purpose of that home, the Airbnb, was an investment property. So you can make that qualify. Vacant land, even though it's not bringing in income, it's sitting there, it is held for investment purposes. So things like that can qualify. So like for like is simply investment for investment. So whether it's a condo and then a house, or a house and then an apartment building, that all qualifies. That's all considered to be within the same like kind atmosphere. So
awesome. So let's just say I'm a realtor. I have a client who has an investment property, and we've determined that their property is a qualifying property and they want to sell, but obviously we want to take advantage of the tax deferment through the 1031 exchange. So tell me, how, from the time that they decide to sell, and now they've made it known, okay, I'm going to do this 1031 exchange. They reach out to you and they're like, hey, let's do this. And you say, this is the next step. And then in reference to the next step, how much time do they have to find the next property? And are there timelines with that?
that's a loaded question. So I'm going to break it down. So if you have a client and they're considering listing the property to sell it, I would love to be involved in that conversation just to be able to explain the process and an exchange isn't necessarily for anyone. So the real purpose of you doing a 1031 exchange is that so that you're not paying tax on the appreciation of the property. So if they've held the property and it's only been short term and they haven't made that much in profit, it might not be beneficial for them to do a 1031 exchange. So it would be great to be involved in that conversation just to be able to educate the client, because I'm big on education, just to go through the process to see if it's even necessary. So if the client is, let's just say they're under contract and they've opened up escrow, I definitely want to be involved because I am working directly with the escrow officer. Because what you need to understand is that in order to have a valid 1031 exchange, the client actually has to use somebody like myself. So they have to hire somebody completely neutral, independent to them, a third party that has no interest in the transaction at hand, just like, 805 title and escrow. So, but there has to be specific documentation in place. And most importantly, they cannot hold their own money. So that's a real hard pill to swallow for some clients who realize that they don't have control of their own money. But unfortunately, that's the way that it's structured and it has to be that way. So the verbiage in the documentation is very specific to the 1031 exchange transaction, because what's happening behind the scenes is that we're actually stepping in on the client's behalf at the moment of close. So we are basically stepping in to say we are going to be operating on their behalf. Please forward the proceeds. Once the netted proceeds, they're going to come to the wire instructions that are going to come our way. So we open up bank accounts for the clients, segregated bank accounts, and that's where the monies are held until they're ready to reinvest. So back to the documentation, it's very specific. And if they were ever audited, there needs to be the paper trail that they hired somebody like ourselves that has this documentation in place and that they never touched their money. So that's why you're hiring us. And so you want to make sure that that information is all happening before it closes. So can we do a fire drill? Absolutely. Do we like to do a fire drill? No, we don't. So it would be great if we could get notified when you're opening up escrow, because that will give us 30, 45 days before the close to get all the documentation in place, get everything signed, and everybody feels comfortable, everything's good. Even if last minute changes come up, like the vesting has changed, we have time to make those changes before the actual closing. So ideally, I would say like reality is maybe 2 weeks before the closing. That's when we really get involved. So if it's less than that, we can make it happen. I've done it the day of. So, but it would be great to have that headway.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so so let's say an investor has their property, they decided they're going to sell their house.
Mhm.
So at what point do they need to start looking for that replacement property to actually utilize the 1031 exchange?
So there are certain time restrictions when it comes to a 1031 exchange. And if you've never done an exchange or helped a client through an exchange, the time restraints are very stressful. So, and they come up very quickly. So when the best time to be searching for a replacement property is probably before they even sold the relinquished. So there's a relinquished property, the property that you sell, and then there is the property that you're purchasing is called the replacement property, just the verbiage. And so the best time to be looking for your replacement property is before you're actually selling the relinquished property. It gives you the most time because your exchange timeframe starts the day that sale transaction closes. And you have a total of 180 days. However, the first 45 days is the most important, in my opinion. That's known as the identification period. So you have 45 days in which to identify replacement property options. And identification means one of two things. It means you are either under contract already to move forward and buy your replacement property. If you're not under contract, then you're providing us a letter that's listing specific property addresses. And if you're not buying 100% of that property, you need to be specific about the percentage that you are buying. And so again, back to my point, if you've never done an exchange before, 45 days is like a blink of the eye. It comes up so fast. So if you've entered into an exchange and the sale closed and that clock is ticking, it's so stressful to then find multiple options that you can possibly write an offer on, especially in a market where it's unpredictable and inventory is limited and you might miss out on opportunities. So that's why you're in control of your own time, and the best time to start is before you've even listed your property for sale.
Right. So setting those expectations with your clients is so incredibly important from the jump. So from the time that you have that first initial conversation, hey, you're thinking about selling, great. Let's make sure that we understand the process. Obviously, you'll have Megan as a resource to cater those conversations if you're not exactly sure. But ultimately, it's setting the expectations, because we don't want our clients to miss out on an opportunity, because there are deadlines and there's ramifications, I'm sure, of these deadlines. So if you don't meet the deadline, then what happens?
Yeah, so there are no extensions to the deadlines. So if you tell me that, what happens because we wrote offers and then the offer didn't get accepted, can I get an extension on my identification timeframe? Absolutely not. You can't. So there's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. And so you just need to know that whether that 45th day or the 180th day falls on a weekend or a holiday, it still needs to be met. So the 45th day, you have till midnight on the 45th day to submit the letter or provide me the contract that you've written an offer on as proof that you have met that requirement, so that you can move forward and reach that or have the additional 135 days to close on that purchase. Now, the 180th day, if we're talking about closing on a purchase, that really needs to be done on or before the 180th day. So if you do not close escrow by day 180 and instead it's on day 181, that's a failed exchange. So you need to make sure that you're coordinating that or staying on top of your own transaction for your client and talking with the escrow officer to make sure that that's closing before that 180th day. An exception to all of this, because we have all been affected by this one way or the other, are these natural disasters. So the only way that there is ever an extension to the 45th or the 180th day is if the government has declared a natural disaster in your area that impacts you, impacts the property, impacts somebody that was a party to the transaction, whether it was on your sale or on your purchase. So we're talking about the recent fires. Those things can affect your exchange, or you could be a part of exchange, but it affects somebody else that was also doing an exchange. So
crazy. That's a lot too, like right now with the fires and everything.
yeah.
So, all right. So let's say the client misses a deadline, okay? Not for natural disasters, right? What happens with that? Because they can't touch their money. They've already sold it. Now they have this chunk of change. What happens?
So we're talking about, let's just say it's the 45th day. So if the client has not identified any replacement properties by the 45th day, the exchange is over on the 46th day. Monies go back to the client. They have full recognition of capital gains taxes. So it is significant. So you want to make sure that you're helping your client to stay on top of them, like to help them find the replacement properties, help them find options so that they're meeting that requirement. I think that first one is the most important. I can't stress that enough, because so many people do not meet that requirement. And then I have to be the bearer of bad news that, now they're going to be there. Well, here we are, we're in the state of California. So there is the withholding tax, but we also have the 3 1/3% California withholding tax. So if a client is doing a 1031 exchange, I know I'm going off subject a little bit, but all these little things just start popping up and I just want to address them. So when a client is doing a 1031 exchange, they can defer the 3 1/3% California state withholding because they're electing to do a 1031 exchange. So when they're filling out their paperwork in the beginning, there's form 593. They can check off box number 10 that's saying that we shouldn't have to pay the withholding because we're doing a 1031 exchange. So now we're at day 46 and they have a failed exchange because they did not identify. I now have to withhold 3 1/3% from the sales price and withhold that and take that from the proceeds for the client and send that to the franchise tax board as if escrow would have done that. So that's another, kicker that you give to a client.
they
Like
don't-
you really get them when they're down.
Yeah, well, Uncle Sam doesn't waste any time getting that money. They don't care.
So, yeah,
Oh, so, okay, so we're talking about tax implications, right?
yeah.
I keep hearing the term boot. Is
Mm.
that what you're referring to? Tell me a little bit about what boot is.
Yes. So a failed exchange means that you have the full tax liability because you never have, you really don't have an exchange at that point. All you have is a sale. So you need to pay taxes on that sale because there is no 1031 exchange because you never reinvested those monies. So boot comes into play when a client hasn't reinvested all of their money. So you can do a partial 1031 exchange. And I'm going to back myself up even further. In order to defer 100% of the capital gains tax, you or your client wants to purchase another property or multiple properties that is equal or greater in value than the property that they sold. That's how you defer and not touch the money. So that's the nutshell, is that's the main goal, is you want to buy equal or greater in value. So there are times where you maybe want to take money. You don't want to reinvest all your money. You want to take some money out. Like I would love to have $100,000 to pay credit card debt or pay off my car and things like that. You can do that. However, you just need to know you're going to be paying tax. So any money that is not reinvested is called boot. So boot actually comes in two forms. There is cash boot, which is just like what I described, but then there's also mortgage boot. So if you are selling your property, let's just break it down. You're selling a property for $1 million. You're paying off a loan for $500,000 and you are netting $500,000 and that's going to go into the exchange. So now you know that you need to replace the value of $1 million. However, you have that $500,000 loan. That too has to be replaced in the exchange. So you can either take on a new loan or you offset it by bringing in your own money. So, and you're reinvesting the $500,000. So we're buying $1 million property. We are taking on a new loan of $500,000 and we are reinvesting our $500,000 of proceeds. That satisfies, and that means you have a complete exchange. However, if you wanted to buy a property that was, say, $700,000, okay, so you want to buy a property for $700,000, you're going to reinvest all of the $500,000, but you're not going to take on enough debt. So you're not meeting the debt requirement, which means that you didn't take on a loan of $500,000. Instead, you took on a loan of $200,000. Thank you. So now you have mortgage boot. So because you didn't meet the value, it means that you didn't replace it either enough debt or you didn't replace either enough cash. So you have mortgage boot or you have cash boot, and that is taxable.
Crazy. That's so, I'm sorry, maybe you guys have the same question. I don't know. Because now I can't wrap my head around, why do we need to get that mortgage? Why is there a mortgage that we have to now, that extra debt that we have to get?
It's the big picture. So when you initially, this $1 million property, let's say that you initially bought it for $500,000 like 10 years ago. And easily in California, you can make $500,000 of appreciation. And so over time, you have probably refinanced on that property. So it's all the big picture of what is the value today, but what did it bring you, or how did it benefit you to get to this point from when you initially acquired it?
Okay.
And so that's what it's taking into consideration. So if you want to defer a gain on that $500,000, then that means that you need to buy another property at today's value.
That's crazy. Okay, I want to come to you guys really quick. We'll take a little second here, breather, to answer any questions. Do we have anybody in the chat that's asking questions?
Yeah, we do.
Yeah, anybody here? Yeah.
I have to- First, for example, can they sell their property that is 1 million and they buy their two property 500 each, or vice versa? So, yeah, so two property and combine it.
Yeah, so you can structure an exchange a multitude of ways. And your question was whether or not you can sell one property for $1 million and buy two properties, each at $500,000, or consolidate from one property or two properties down into one property. You absolutely can do that. So you can structure, this is what I find, it gets me jazzed about 1031 exchanges because there's no two exchanges that are ever really the same. So yes, as long as you are finding the value and meeting the value of the 1031 exchange, you can buy multiple properties. It's how you build wealth. It's how you diversify your assets, which is another benefit of doing a 1031 exchange besides tax deferral. So it allows you to get to the next step, but it also, I think it minimizes your taxable event down the road. So if you, let's just bring it back to the first example that I gave you. So if you initially bought a property for $500,000 and now you're selling it for $1 million, you know, you have a $500,000 taxable gain if you don't do an exchange. And so in your scenario, instead of buying one property, if you buy multiple properties, then you have not only multiple assets, but now you're kind of minimizing the taxable gain of one asset that you acquired through an exchange if you decide to sell that one down the road. So I view it as like a ladder. So whenever you're doing a 1031 exchange, each property that you're acquiring in an exchange is carrying you up the next rung of the ladder, right? One for one for one. So now if you're buying multiple properties, instead of going straight up, you're kind of starting to go out. So if you initially bought it down here and now you're selling it up here, your gain and your tax liability is significant versus buying, instead of going all the way up here, you're buying properties out here. So if you sold one of these properties, your tax liability is shortened where these others can grow and continue to do exchanges, if that makes sense. I know my hands are all over the place, but
My example, so
Yes.
bought a house for 1.5. Now we want to sell it for 4 million. So we want to buy two properties. One, as investment, and is a possibility later on he using another, one of them as an owner occupied. So what will happen?
so your client is initially bought a property for $1.5 million, and now they want to buy,
I'm going to sell it for 4.
sell it for $4 million
Mhm.
And buy two properties.
and buy two properties, and then eventually,
Move in.
right? So so yes, the question is 1.5 million, and then buy 4 million, two properties. But eventually he wants to live in one of the two properties that he acquires through a 1031 exchange. You want to make sure if your client, yes, it is, to answer your question, yes, it is possible. However, you want to make sure that you're meeting the requirement to satisfy the exchange so it doesn't raise a flag. And what I mean by that is you want to make sure that you are holding on to both properties and reporting them as an investment property for a considerable amount of time before he decides to convert it into a primary residence or report it that he's going to live there. So make sure that he's reporting those properties. And I will say that there is no specific time frame that is mentioned in the tax code that defines how long someone needs to hold on to it. It's based on interpretation or case studies. So I will say that enough tax advisors have given two different scenarios. Hold on to the property and report it for a minimum of 1 tax period, and others, and I think that that's kind of loose. I would say the more conservative approach that advisors would give is to hold on to that property and report it for at least 2 tax periods before you decide to convert it into a primary residence. So by converting it into a primary residence isn't triggering any taxable event because there is no sale. You're just now reporting how you're using the property to the IRS. So now if your client eventually wants to sell that $2 million asset or whatever it's worth at that time, now that property would no longer apply for a 1031 exchange. It would be under his primary residence exclusion, which is section 121 of the tax code. So, but that is limited to only $250,000 of the gain if he's filing single, or $500,000 of the gain if he's filing married. So, but then if you wanted to do an exchange, you would need to then rent it back out for another year or 2 years. So you can flip flop, you know, so it's about planning ahead.
Awesome.
Another
Cool.
question online.
Oh, we're going to do one online and then we're going to come right over to you guys. Yeah.
Can you explain the advantages of a Delaware statutory trust, DSTs, any cons relating to this action? Is there a timeline requirement for leaving the fund in a DST and then securing a new rental investment? Repeat that one.
Sure. So the question was to just briefly discuss what a DST is, if there's any time restraints or cons really, or benefits and cons to investing into a DST. So when I talked about like kind and I said that investments come in different forms, this is one of those kind of different forms where it is real estate, but it really is a securitized real estate asset. So a DST stands for Delaware Statutory Trust. A DST is actually a securitized real estate investment, which means that you are not buying it through a real estate agent. Instead, you're buying it through a financial broker. So you're going to somebody who has a particular license. I forget what license, it's 60 or something. And so the DST is in the commercial real estate realm. So that's really, we're talking about, they look like apartment buildings, storage facilities, things along those lines. And so you have to qualify in order to be able to even invest into a DST, which means that you have to make a certain amount of income per year, or you have to have a net worth of at least $1 million that's excluding your primary residence. So a lot of people don't even qualify in order to consider that as being an option. Now, what it is it stands for Delaware Statutory Trust. And think of it this way, is that you have a large company and they are referred to as a sponsor. And the sponsor owns this asset, this apartment building or what have you, in this Delaware Statutory Trust. So they are a trust. Your client is an investor into the DST, but they don't get a direct deed to the property. Instead, they get a beneficial interest into this investment. So they get monthly distributions based on how much money they're investing into this asset. So the good thing about a DST is that you can also you can acquire their debt. So if you sold your $1 million property that had a $500,000 loan and you no longer want to be an active landlord, you can invest in a DST, which is completely passive income because you're just getting monthly checks, but it allows you to buy $1 million and take on or assume at least $500,000 of their debt, and allows you to reinvest your $500,000 of proceeds. So the benefit is that you don't have to go out and personally obtain a new loan, especially with these higher interest rates. And so the downfall, I think, of DSTs, in my opinion, is that your hands are completely tied. So you do not have control of this asset. So you get to be a passive investor. You get to sit back and eat bonbons and receive your checks, but you cannot control how the property is managed. And you cannot control, once you're in it, you cannot get out of it. So you are completely tied. The average lifespan, if you will, for a DST is about 7 to 10 years. So long enough, not long enough for others. So that's what a DST is. And it is an option specifically for 1031 exchange investors.
Very cool. What do we have? Yes, right over here.
My name is Karen. I probably this question I'll push to a boss. I do have a first question is, do you guys do commercial? The client I have right now is, they have out of the state with apartment complex. We're talking about large dollar sign. They have their own land plus more, like 19, and another one 60 apartment complex. Brand new close, and they max out their cap rate and they want to move to California. My question is, I have a project, the max is about 10 to 17 mil.
Mhm.
I'm hoping this guy. The thing that, the time right now, to sell that and make it a rental.
Mhm.
Actually, find one was perfect for them. It was not sold. And then my question, because they're income property. I have someone give me an idea was near the, some UC college, I'm just saying that, you know. It's LA Fitness, it's perfect at 17 mil total, done. And then annual income is 1.25. We're talking about 10 years to pay it off with the land, with the building. But they're saying, oh, we're putting the whole risk to one basket. I don't know, is it qualified for this? Is it equal?
So let me try to reframe this. So what you're asking or what you're saying is that you have a client who's got all these amazing commercial properties, multi-units, a mobile home park, and they want to sell those and then exchange it for something in California. And you're wondering if, because it's commercial and income property, is it, let me clarify please for me, is it that you're wondering if it qualifies because it's income to income, meaning income property, or just in general? Oh, okay. She's asking if it's like,
No, they're supposed to be the income to income, right? And then fitness is different kind than apartment complex, right? So is it equal? Is it
yeah.
equal?
Is it because it's commercial? Does that,
Is it good?
I think she's asking like for like property.
yeah.
Yeah, so the answer to your question is absolutely. You can do a 1031 exchange. So again, it's,
not
Gonna get this one.
And then if I can do another thing is they make when they say, oh, apartment is not solely on the increasing the price. Let's do switching office space are not good. Let's switch to storage are great investment. Is it good?
Is, yeah, would storage, you're saying, would like something like a storage unit be a good like property?
yeah, so your client is very literal about the like kind term. So it's investment property for investment property. It's as simple as that. So it's as simple as that.
It's 45 days and 8 days the same.
Yes, that never changes. So we're talking about whether it's commercial or residential real estate, it all applies to this particular conversation. Yeah.
Very good.
Thank you so much.
So that's good news for you. You're gonna get it. That's awesome. Yeah, right.
How much 1031 exchange can you do in a year?
There's no limit.
No limit?
No. No. Well, are you talking about doing it the same thing over and over?
Yeah.
Like if they have multiple properties and doing,
Well,
yes. So you don't, yes, you can, there's no limitation on how many times you set up a 1031 exchange. They call it swap till you drop. So you can
Nice.
keep swapping properties until you die. And then here's the other beauty about exchanging and dying is that if you do exchange into, you know, multiple properties and you pass away, your heirs acquire these properties, but they get a step up in basis. So if they do not want to hold on to these properties, they're not going to have a tax liability because that they get the step up in basis means that the value becomes the date that you passed away is their inherited value date.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's another benefit. So
Very cool. Sweet. Yep. The client offering. So I have a client offering a seller finance deal structured as an interest-only loan with a 4-year balloon payment. The buyer plans to use the structure to finance the plans and permits needed for construction, as it's the only way the deal makes sense. Given this structure, how would a 1031 exchange apply, and what are the potential tax liabilities for the seller, particularly at the balloon payment stage? Additionally, are there any structuring strategies that could help optimize the tax treatment for the seller in this scenario? Ooh.
that's a real good
Get in there, girl.
question. That's a good one. So I'm gonna kind of break apart his question a little bit. So when you're doing a 1031 exchange and we're talking about seller carryback financing, there are options that you or your client really needs to consider. And so when we're talking about a note, the client needs to decide whether the note is going to be included in the exchange or excluded from the exchange. So in this scenario, if the client does not, so any notes are treated as income, right? So, you know, if you're carrying back a note, somebody's making payments to you, that's income to you that you have to report. And so if you decide to keep the note outside of the exchange, that means that you remain the maker of the note and you continue to receive the payments on that note for the duration of the terms of that agreement. And you will get taxed outside of the exchange as the income is received for each year that it's brought in. Okay, so that's option number one. Option number two is that you want to keep the note inside of the exchange and make those payments and that money received tax deferred. This is where it gets a little bit complicated, doable though. So the note would actually be made payable to us. So the payments would come to us and they'd be included with the remaining proceeds that were being held in the 1031 exchange account. However, this is where it gets good, is that the note either has to be paid off or sold within their 180-day time frame.
Oh,
So if it's a small note and your client has the cash, then they might as well pay the note off themselves and include that amount of that balloon payment, if you will, in with the exchange proceeds. And so then basically they'll continue to get the income on that note, but it's not going to be taxable because they've technically paid that off in the exchange and included those funds in with the exchange proceeds that are already being held. Did I lose you? So that's the hard part, is because you're making this note and you have these terms of this note, it's hard to sell the note. And that's really the reality, is it's hard to sell the note because they're your terms, not somebody else's. So, you know, it would be great if you could go on your replacement property to say, I have X amount of exchange proceeds, but I also have this note. And I will make you the maker of the note and you can continue receiving the payments on this note. It really doesn't happen, quite honestly, because the terms typically aren't favorable to that person. And then there's no guarantee that if that person stops making the payments, what recourse does that person actually have? So most people, when they're talking about a note, keep it outside of the exchange. So that's,
yeah, so that would be,
yeah, I think I answered the question.
yeah. Okay. Yes.
Is there any difference in terms of processing between 1031 exchange versus DST? You know,
what's the process time between, is it DTS?
DST.
DST, yeah. My dyslexia is kicking in really good.
DSTs, if we're talking about purchasing a DST versus any other real estate transaction, they happen lickety split, very fast. So people who know that they're going to invest into a DST do it for a couple of reasons. And one of them is that they can readily identify a DST very quickly. So in order to meet that identification requirement by day 45, a DST is a great option as a filler because you can find it and you can get it, and they're everywhere across the United States.
Right.
So, but the process is quick.
But what process quick, besides that, is anything the client need to know particulars besides already identified the, you know, DST thing? What's your role coming to this space?
For DTS? D? Yeah.
What did you do?
So I'm transacting my role when it comes to somebody who's investing in a DST is I'm documenting the exchange transaction to make sure that that's shown and reflected as a legitimate purchase, as a replacement property purchase to meet the requirements of the 1031 exchange. So if somebody tells me that they want to invest in a DST, then I'm coordinating with the financial advisor and the broker and working with the sponsor's closing company to wire the funds towards that acquisition. And that's what I'm doing for the client with the DST. I'm not the broker for the DST, but
So if someone is interested, what you're basically asking, if someone is interested in that as an option, could they speak to Megan in reference to that?
Why need to now or just go?
so that's a great question. So with the DST, they typically have their own closing company that handles the closing, or they'll work with another title company to handle that particular type of closing. So there, whenever you're investing in any real estate transaction, there needs to be a closer. On the West Coast, escrow and title. On the East Coast, it's attorneys. So it just depends where that investment is to determine the type of closing officer that you're using for that transaction. But I'm working with whomever that is. Yeah.
Awesome. Very good. We had another question? Yeah.
So can you buy? The 1031 exchange?
Can I buy?
Buy it, then like I sell my investment.
The question is whether or not you can buy a property first before you've sold anything. That's a real good question. So now we're talking about, there are different types of 1031 exchanges. The most common, I will call it as a deferred or a standard forward exchange. The question that you're asking is actually classified as a reverse 1031 exchange. So they are more complicated and more costly, however, completely legit and doable. So if you have found a replacement property before you are ready to sell your relinquished property, this is when a 1031 exchange would come into play. I will say that you have to be able, your client needs to be able to afford to buy that property without relying on the proceeds from the sale. So a lot of times it takes the client out of the mix because a lot of them can't afford to do that. Two thoughts about that. So if you're buying first and we're talking about a reverse 1031 exchange, whatever exchange you're putting together, you're doing it so you always have a sale close first and then a purchase. So with this reverse 1031 exchange structure, the way that we create it, it's kind of like a backwards roundabout way to meet that same goal. So with the reverse 1031 exchange, we are creating an LLC. It's known as an EAT, which stands for an exchange accommodator title holder. So the LLC, the purpose of the LLC is to take title to the property, the replacement property, on your client's behalf and merely hold title to that. So it's not directly in their name, okay? All money is going to go, that is funded by the client, is for the benefit of this LLC. So your client needs to be able to loan the cash or obtain financing so the LLC can buy the property for them. You with me?
Yes.
Okay. So hypothetically, let's say the client has all the cash and we create a promissory note and the LLC acquires title. We are the member of the LLC. You or your client is the manager. So they have capacity to lease the property, sublease the property, rent it out. They have that management capabilities. So they have control. They can sign contracts as being the manager. So everything is legit in that front. So hypothetically, let's just say that the client is now, the LLC is on title to the replacement property. Now your client can sell the relinquished property like they normally would directly to the buyer in the 1031 exchange. The sale, the proceeds from that sale will come to us for a moment, and then we in turn will turn around and pay back the client for loaning the money to the LLC. The acquisition technically is they are going to be taking on and we're transferring the membership interest of the LLC over to the client. And that's happening a day after they sold the relinquished property. So again, it's like this circular. And so I will say that if a client needs a loan in order for the LLC to buy the property, it's very difficult to get financing because it's not your typical conventional financing because the loan needs to be named in the LLC name, but it's going to be guaranteed by your client. So not everyone, I do have great lenders up in Santa Barbara who understand this and have a specific product specifically for 1031 exchanges. And the cost for that is significant. So the cost for us to do a reverse exchange is almost $8,000, where a typical standard forward exchange is about $1,200.
Yeah.
So we're
So
talking.
bottom line, we're just not going to do that. Yeah.
Yes.
Sufficient money for buying it.
Yeah.
Hmm.
It is how long they have time to sell this one and pay that?
Mhm.
And then, how long they have it, and,
Well, so the time frame for reverse exchange, which is your question, is the same as a standard forward exchange. So it's still 180 days. However, the identification component is what the property is going to be being sold. That didn't come out right. You're identifying what you're selling versus in a standard forward exchange, you're identifying what you're buying. So most people buy their replacement property without knowing, maybe they have multiple assets and they don't know exactly which one they're going to sell. That's where the identification comes into play, is that you have to tell me specifically which property you're going to sell that is going to satisfy the reverse exchange that we just set up. But it's a total of 180 days.
I remember the first question. The thing is, when they decided to buy it, they have to involve you from the first place.
For the reverse exchange? Yes, so the question is whether, when and if they are buying the property, if they have to involve me. Absolutely, because the most important is that we need to make sure that we're getting the LLC set up. So it does need to be disclosed that it is part of a 1031 exchange, but there's different documentation that we have to put in place that talks about why we're doing this, how we're doing it, and the role that this LLC is playing in this conversion. So, but I will say that if you are doing a reverse exchange, your client, this is the semantics of it, is that your client may go ahead and write an offer and the offer gets accepted and the initial contract is in their name. And now they want to do this 1031 exchange. How do they get it from their name into the name of the LLC? It's as simple as creating addendum to the contract that is substituting this buyer. So if you are maybe setting this up for your client and you're writing an offer, then I would suggest that you put in this verbiage in the contract that will make it easier once it gets into escrow. And I would have you write their name and next to it say and or assigns. And that will let the escrow officer know that they're probably going to assign it to another entity or another person.
And just keep in mind too, guys, in your contract in the RPA, it is already written in there by default that your client has 17 days, unless otherwise stated, to have this scenario happen. So it is your acquisition time. You can sell the contract to an entity or, of course, 1031 exchange or whatever. But yeah, if you want to go above and beyond too, the and or signs is really important. So yeah, but you know what? One of the things that I do want to bring up too, especially if you are representing a client on the purchase of a property that's participating in a 1031 exchange, perhaps that listing agent isn't familiar with 1031 exchange. Some of the questions that come up are, oh, is this going to cost my clients any money? Is this going to infringe on our timelines and all that? And we could talk about the cost associated with, and it's never a burden of the seller, correct? Like it's always on the buyer. So on the replacement property.
Correct. And that it actually kind of baffles me that the other party would have an issue with it because it has no bearing on their transaction. It's just on your side of the transaction for your client. So yeah, if you want to do it, I think the contract might even have the verbiage that says something to the effect
at no
that there
cost
is
to the seller. Yep.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, but I know that it is something that comes up with agents who aren't familiar with certain things. And so kudos to you guys for being here. Do we have any other final questions on the, okay, what do we got?
Eric from Andrew, what are common mistakes investors make?
Oh, that was actually one of our questions that we wanted to go over. Yeah, we're short on time, but we'll definitely go over that and address one other. But yeah, what are some common mistakes that are made with investors?
I think there are quite a few.
Probably timeline, I'm assuming, right?
So I would say the first one is that I feel like clients, just because maybe they've made so much money and maybe the market is hot, that they jump in and decide to sell their property and have no idea where they're going to reinvest. And so now the clock is ticking and they're feeling pressed for time, and they might end up either not reinvesting and not identifying a replacement property, or they get into an asset that they really don't want. So maybe they jump into a property that is not making that money, that's not in a good location, and now they just invested all this, and now what do they do? So I think that's the first mistake. The second mistake is when you have the identification letter. A lot of people only identify one property. when you're doing a 1031 exchange, I highly suggest that you help your clients identify more than one property. I had a client, a significant client, who thought it was a done deal, no brainer, moving forward. Literally at the 11th hour, so we're talking at 11 o'clock at night on his 45th day, he discovers that the TIC, the tenant in common that he was buying into, was a sham. He had no other properties identified, and he couldn't move forward in his exchange. He could not find something else within 1 hour to satisfy that requirement. So my suggestion is that you make sure and you help your client find multiple suitable investment properties that will meet that requirement. And I will say that this is a question that I do get from clients, is that I have identified replacement property, and if I'm past my 45th day and those properties are no longer available, can I still complete my 1031 exchange? The answer is no.
Timelines.
So, yeah, so you have to, the only way that we can reinvest and release the monies in a client's exchange is if the properties that they plan to acquire were properly identified. So if you're telling me that those properties that are on the letter are no longer available, it would be fraudulent for me, a tax fraud, for me to release those monies towards a property that did not meet that requirement. So your monies would be, your client's monies, I'm sorry, would be held hostage in the exchange account until the 180th day expired. So because once those monies hit the exchange account, they cannot just be released at any point in time. So they can only be released towards a legitimate purchase closing or at the expiration of the 45th or the 180th day. So if they're past the 45th day, they've obviously have met the identification requirement, but now they don't have the purchase. So that means the monies need to stay in that exchange account until the 181st day. So that is a big mistake. Yeah.
Quick question. From one of my investors, he asked me if, say he sells a property, does put it in exchange, and he doesn't identify a property, until like a month later, 2 months later, that money that gets allocated into that account, who keeps the interest?
So I will say that we keep the interest. Yeah. So what's great about our industry is that it's not completely regulated. So it depends on who you work with. But you know, every exchange that we do, we're making $1,200. So the majority of how we survive in this business is off the interest that we make off the client's monies. Yeah. So if it is a significant deal, I mean, we're talking, you know, significant, then it's a negotiation at that point. So yeah.
What's significant? Right, it's negotiable.
Her client, right? Yeah.
Jackie had a question.
And just to like clarify, because we kind of talked about it earlier, but just with the LA fires, as far as a property that was identified as a replacement property that was damaged in the fires, they are going to be given that extension. So it's covered also on properties they are identifying, not just on their property they need to sell.
Yeah, so you're asking about the extension for those that were affected by the LA fires, and your client was directly involved. So a property that they identified was affected by the fires. Do they get that extension? Yes, they have it was directly affected them. And so that would be, I would still suggest that you tell your client to double check that with their accountant. You know, you always, when we're talking about tax advice, you never want to be the person that says, yeah, definitely. So you always want to deflect.
Realtors know. Seek advice. We'll get your questions after, if that's okay. We just want to wrap it up a little bit for those that are on Zoom hanging out. So basically what we've learned today is that 1031 exchanges are not just black and white. There's so many nuances with it. There's just so much to them. It's amazing that you guys are getting the general information so that you can educate your clients. But what's most important is aligning yourself with the experts. And so, Megan, thank you so much for doing the presentation today and for giving us all of your amazing advice and guidance on this. Everyone's situation is different, right? So make sure that you take her information. Her card is right in front of, for those of you that have asked for the information on Zoom, we will definitely get that to you guys. But reach out. From the very beginning, as soon as you have a client that's interested in selling and participating in a 1031 exchange, or they're just asking you, hey, like, what are my options? Oh, what about this? Reach out to Megan, reach out to the specialist, and just have her included in those conversations. So that way you don't have to know everything. You can actually just rely on those that do know everything. And then now you still look like the hero, right? Let's do that. Let's have an amazing day. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Remember, every month, 805 Escrow hosts monthly trainings. We also just want to give a little quick pitch too. We also provide a lot of resources and marketing to our realtor partners. So if that's something that you're interested in, partnering with a company that actually wants you to succeed and build your businesses, reach out to the person that invited you to our event and ask them, how can we do business together? How can we partner? And how can you help me grow? So with that being said, thank you so much for joining us today. We hope to see you on the next one. Thank you.